Amen.
If you haven't got food yet, please finish getting food, but we're going to go ahead and get started so we stay on time. Thank you for coming out to Health Law Association and Federalist Society meeting on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. Just a couple updates for HLA. Please be on the lookout for our next meeting on February 26th. And then also stay tuned. If you're a mentor in our mentor program, please reach out to your mentees, help them out with any OCI process or any other jobs that they may be looking to apply.
Okay, for FedSoc, this is a Federal Society event. I have a couple announcements, but first, as always, going to read our creed. The Federal Society stands to promote the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province of the jury to say what the law is and not what it should be. And to be on theme with our kind of debate, discuss, decide, we have a debate today, which is awesome. And we're welcoming Professor Josh Blackman from South Texas College of Law. But before I do that, wait. Tomorrow, if you guys are interested in going to Phoenix, Arizona, and seeing Professor Josh Blackman,
I'll be there.
Please come to our informational session, which will be tomorrow at noon in the 12th floor pavilion. I'll just be sitting at a table, give you all the information about that. Really great opportunity. Anyways, so Professor Josh Blackman is an associate professor of law at the South Texas College of Law in Houston, who specializes in constitutional law, the United States Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. Josh is the author of the critically acclaimed Unprecedented, the Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare, and Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. Josh was selected by Forbes magazine for the 30 Under 30 in Law and Policy. Josh has twice testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the constitutionality of executive action on immigration and healthcare. He is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Josh is the founder and president of the Harlan Institute, the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, the internet's premier Supreme Court fantasy league, which is amazing.
You should all play.
And blogs at joshblackman.com. Josh is the author of over 4 dozen law review articles, and his commentary has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today, LA Times, and other national publications. So let's welcome Josh, everyone.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, my first time at SLU, and I'm very grateful to have a discussion on the ACA. Now, you may ask yourself, wait a minute, Josh. Didn't the Supreme Court already uphold Obamacare in 2012, right? Why are we here again a second time? Well, let me tell you the story. As I'm sure you all recall, in 2012, Chief Justice Roberts wrote majority opinion in NFIB versus Sebelius. And the court considered whether Congress had the power to compel people to buy health insurance. This was a so-called individual mandate of the ACA. Long story short, Chief Justice Roberts voted to uphold the law. But he did so in a very specific fashion. He found that because the law in many respects resembles a tax, that is, you have to pay some money if you go uninsured, he could uphold it, right? He said, the best reading of the law is that it's a command to buy health insurance, but I can read it differently. I can read this merely as a tax on those who go uninsured. It's not a tax in reality, but I can read it that way. And this gave rise to the so-called saving construction in NFIB. And as a result, the ACA largely, not entirely, but largely survived as it was enacted. Fast forward about 5 years. In 2017, Congress enacted the tax cut bill, right? This massive tax reform legislation. Now, I don't care about tax law. It's not my thing. I couldn't care less. But there was one provision of the law that was very significant. One provision of the law said we are going to take the penalty in the ACA, that's a penalty for going uninsured, and we're going to reduce it to $0. We're not going to actually strike it out of the statute. We'll just reduce the penalty to $0. So starting now, 2019, if any American who's subject to the mandate goes uninsured, they don't have to pay anything, right? There's a $0 penalty that results from going uninsured. Now you're thinking, wait, Josh, that's great, right? Well, that raises an important question, right? The ACA was saved because the law in many regards resembled a tax. It raised revenue. What happens when it no longer raises revenue? Can it still be saved? Now, I think about these things, and as Congress was debating this tax cut bill, I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, Obamacare is now unconstitutional, right? I don't think I was the only one to think that, but a lot of other people apparently agreed with me. And last year, the state of Texas and about 20 other states, I think Missouri was on it also, with Attorney General Hawley, now Senator, filed a lawsuit in Texas, and they asserted that the individual mandate can no longer be saved as a constitutional tax. What was the remedy they sought? They sought a couple remedies. First, they said they want to declare the mandate unconstitutional. That by itself would make law professors like me very excited because I think it's a good ruling. But for practical purposes, it wouldn't really have much impact because if you want to go uninsured, you're not going to pay a penalty, so who cares, right? But the alternative remedy that the states asked for was to declare unconstitutional the entirety of the ACA. And they argue that in NFIB, there were 4 joint dissenters. It was Scalia, Kennedy, Thomas, and Alito. And they said that if the mandate goes, the entire law goes. There was a third option, which Texas also argued. They said, well, if you kill the mandate, you also have to set aside the law's guaranteed issue and community rating provisions. What are, I'll just say GI, CR, because it's a mouthful, right? What are GI and CR? These are the regulations in the law that say you can't discriminate against sick people. That you have to issue a policy, and you can't set the price of the policy based on a person's health conditions, right? These are probably the most popular aspects of the Affordable Care Act. So Texas said, okay, either option A, you just kill the mandate, option B, you kill the mandate plus the GICR, and option C, you kill the entire thing. Okay. So they brought this challenge almost a year ago now. And about a month ago, in middle of December, a federal district court judge in Fort Worth, Texas, took door number 3. He said that the mandate is no longer constitutional, and because the mandate is so closely integral with the entire ACA, that the entire law must fall. Now, the judge did not issue what's the most common remedy nowadays, a nationwide injunction, right? He did not issue a nationwide injunction to stop Obamacare in its tracks. Instead, the judge said, I'm going to issue this ruling, and he put it on hold, pending appeal. And actually, that appeal was frozen for a bit, pending the government shutdown. Now that the government's, I guess, reopening, the case will go back in the pipeline. But at this juncture, we won't get any ruling from the Fifth Circuit probably till the summertime, if I had to guess, right? And that means we probably won't get any decision from the U.S. Supreme Court till June 2020. That's not about right? Yeah. Which means right before the presidential election, right? So let me walk you through this case and why I think it's perhaps being a little bit underestimated. The first thing to keep in mind is that the Trump administration took a different position than I think the Obama administration would have taken, or perhaps the Clinton administration. First, the Attorney General released an opinion in which he found that the individual mandate was no longer constitutional. He agreed with Texas that because the revenue was cut out and no longer raised any funds, it can't resemble a tax. The AG took another opinion, which is perhaps even more controversial. The opinion he took is this: because the mandate is essential to the operation of the GICR, these pre-existing condition protections, you can't separate them. And if the court sets aside the mandate, the court also has to set aside the GICR, right? You can't disentangle these provisions. And indeed, that was the same provision that Eric Holder took in 2012 under the Obama administration. Now, something very big happened between 2012 and 2017, of course, which is that Congress, mostly Republicans, in fact, all Republicans, voted to drop the penalty to 0. So the argument goes like this. When Congress in 2017 voted to drop the penalty to 0, did they intend to kill Obamacare? Right? Did they intend to render other aspects of the law inoperable? or do they just want to make the penalty and the mandate ineffective? Now, if you were to probably take a poll of the Republicans in Congress who voted for this bill, you probably would tell you different things. But I think they would probably all agree, no, we don't want to kill all of Obamacare. We just want to kill the unpopular parts, right? Which is the penalty that people have to pay for going uninsured. So when you're talking about severability, there's a question of legislative intent. So you have the intent of Congress in 2012 saying the mandate can't exist without these other parts. And you have this intent from Congress in 2017 saying the mandate can exist without these other parts. Okay, in this case, a district court judge said, I find that the intent of Congress in 2017 is not controlling. They didn't change the statute itself, they merely reduced the penalty. Therefore, there's no severability. Okay. I think that's a fairly basic summary of the case, and we can get to specifics in a minute. But I want to address a few, I think, easy questions that are perhaps a little bit tougher to answer, right? How can the court declare the individual mandate unconstitutional? Didn't the court already uphold it? A law's constitutionality usually is set. Either it is or it isn't, right? But Chief Justice Roberts wrote a very unique opinion which said, the law is constitutional if certain conditions hold. And if those conditions no longer hold, and I think the argument goes, it becomes unconstitutional. Now, it's very rare that any court will consider the constitutionality of a law twice. And I think, again, it's very bizarre. You know, like Schrodinger's cat, right, where it's both alive and dead at the same time. I call this Schrodinger's mandate, right, where it's both constitutional and unconstitutional at the same time. If, for example, in 2019, President Elizabeth Warren decides to raise the mandate to $1, then it becomes constitutional again. It's a very weird setup, and I think I blame John Roberts for a lot of things. I blame him for this. But the first part enough is I think the law can be both constitutional and unconstitutional depending on the circumstances, right? The more pressing question, the one I think a lot of people have difficulty with is, if the penalty is $0, what are you challenging, right? If there's no financial consequence for going uninsured, what is there left to even challenge in court? A related question is, who has standing, right? You can't just walk into a federal court and complain about something. You have to assert that there's been an injury, in fact, that you've been actually injured. So how can it be, number one, that there's even something to challenge if there's no penalty? And issue number two, who would even have standing? I think there's a separate question, but they're very closely related. And this part, I think, actually gets a little bit philosophical. And I don't mean to get all wishy-washy, but it's true. 5 minutes left. Thank you, sir. Believe it or not, people will often comply with the law even if there's no consequences for failing to comply with the law. I know it sounds strange to law students, but for some people at least, following the law is itself a moral issue, right? And you might think, Josh, you're full of it. This is not true. The numbers actually back this up. Various government agencies, the Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Committee on Taxation, they've reported that even without a penalty, that is, there's a mandate but no penalty, people will still go ahead and buy health insurance because they think it's the right thing to do. Now, I agree. This number is probably very small, right? I think most people say, woohoo, there's no penalty, let me go uninsured, I don't care, right? But there are some people who I think do feel compelled by the law. And I think those people would have standing. In fact, this case does have 2 individuals with standing. There's another injury that's a hell of a lot easier. We're coming up on April 15th soon. Taxes, right? When you all do your taxes, which I think you've all done at one point in your life, there's a question on the return that says, were you insured throughout 2018? You've all seen this question, right? You gotta check yes or you gotta check no. If you check no, you have to fill out some other form, right? So even if there's no financial penalty, the tax form, I think, gives you an injury because you have to fill out a form. I know it sounds stupid, but that's an injury. The standing is not a very big hurdle. It's actually fairly slight as long as you have something. I can't make that argument with any certainty because the form doesn't exist yet. That form won't be released till next year, but I think I'm right, at least. Okay. So the question then is, assuming that they're standing, and assuming that there's actually sort of several, there's actually a injury in fact, I think the much harder question is severability, right? If the Supreme Court just went and said, you know what, because of the John Roberts saving construction, the mandate's no longer constitutional, I consider that a victory, right? If all the court did was say that the mandate's unconstitutional, I would be very happy. I would put that case in my casebook, and I would teach it for decades. But if it goes beyond that, I think it has to contend with a couple big issues. So first, how do you deal with the problem where you have Congress, number one, that expresses one intent, and Congress, number two, that expresses another intent? And the way I think about this is actually a little bit counterintuitive, and I'll explain why. Congress, number two, did something bad, right? The Republican Congress dropped the penalty down to $0. Any competent lawyer should have recognized that that would be effectively rendering a statute unconstitutional. Follow me here. Generally, what do courts do when an act of government is unconstitutional? They set aside that act. So what is the correct remedy to this problem? Increase the tax. Follow me here, right? The screw up, what was unconstitutional, is actually dropping the penalty to $0. If the court were to actually follow through on what I think is the correct doctrine, they would increase the tax, increase the penalty back to $700 a year, and impose the tax that keeps the law constitutional. So I actually think, again, this is against interest. I don't like the penalty, but I think the correct remedy would have been to just repeal the mandate and the tax together, but they didn't have the votes for that. So actually, what they could have done was just, the court can say, we'll go increase the tax. But, and here's the big but, I have a minute left. No one challenged the tax cut, right? Courts can't randomly modify laws that weren't actually challenged in court. So from the available remedies left, the court's only remedy, I think, is to say, we have this violation. The only way we can remedy this violation is to set aside the mandate and perhaps, I think at a minimum, the guaranteed issue committee rating provisions. All right, I am out of time, I think. Our timer was stolen, apparently. But I'll turn to my good friend, and we'll have a discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm glad that you turned out for this. I'm not a constitutional law scholar. I run into it when I work on health law. And so I'm going to try to set the stage here for addressing this issue in a fuller context, and one that I think gets to some basic things about which I think all of us would agree. I think the largest thing that's going on here is to understand what really is behind door number 3. If the Texas federal court ended up repealing or declaring unconstitutional the entire statute, it's important to understand what's there. It's not just the mandate, it's not just this tax, it's all of the consumer protection insurance reforms, some of which Professor Blackman addressed. It has to do with being covered under your parents' insurance until you're 26. It's the exclusion it is the prohibition against excluding coverage for pre-existing conditions. It's the medical loss ratio that makes sure that insurance companies are spending their premium dollars primarily on your good health, your coverage, instead of on profits or payments to executives. It's about clear and insurance labeling through exchanges so that a consumer can go on and make apples to apples comparisons despite all the intricacies that go into the differences in coverages and the differences in cost sharing that you find across insurance. It's about repealing the Medicare Shared Savings Plan, and some of you don't know what that is, but it's designed to try to get to control of one of the worst problems that we have in healthcare, and that's cost escalations. The Medicare Shared Savings Program ends up incentivizing large organizations large enough to have multiple hospitals, laboratories, physicians, and clinics, large enough to serve at least 5,000, all the medical needs of at least 5,000 Medicare recipients, subject to a target, and if they can beat that target, if they can end up spending less of Medicare's money than Medicare would have spent, then that savings is shared back with that organization. That disappears. The donut hole, which is a way to describe a problem with coverage for people in Medicare with prescription drug benefits, that's covered up to a certain amount and then uncovered. And not until you get up to a catastrophic level of payments for your prescriptions does coverage come back in. That's slowly being closed as a part of the ACA. That goes away. Resolving problems with respect to payments to providers, very low. At private insurers, as they consolidate, have done a great job of negotiating with healthcare providers in order to get them to agree to lower prices. Medicare just sets lower prices, and Medicaid sets even lower prices. The ACA addressed part of that. That's also going to disappear. What was the state of our healthcare system in 2010 before the ACA was enacted? Well, we had between 70 and 80 million people who were either uninsured, 45 to 50 million, or underinsured, 25 to 30 million, which meant that we had between 70 and 80 million people in the United States who were not prepared to deal with the medical bills that would even come from a moderate illness or injury that required treatment, let alone a catastrophic one. We had millions of days of lack of productivity. Children missing school, people missing work because they needed to be with their children, people going to work despite the fact that they were sick because they didn't want to get fired and making other people sick. People causing more expense for the healthcare system because they allowed their problem to fester before finally saying, I think it's become an emergency and I need to go to the emergency room. A much more expensive place to get care with a problem that's much worse than it was. We have problems with personal bankruptcies during that time, bad debt to hospitals. Lots of inner city and rural hospitals closing or declaring bankruptcies themselves. Unfair or non-existent individual insurance market problems. It was very difficult to shop on the individual insurance market. It was difficult to compare. You needed to have a broker. And sometimes you couldn't find that you were even eligible to receive insurance whatsoever. Unaffordable small business market. Payment systems that rewarded treatment but didn't reward good health outcomes. Now, the ACA didn't solve all of these problems, but the ACA tried to address all of these problems. And it created a framework that balanced a couple of things that are important in our culture. One is that we tend to say, let's let the free market run in order to achieve efficiency, and only regulate where we absolutely have to and where that regulation is going to make us better off. The ACA placed regulations on top of fundamentally a free market system, something that we've done repeatedly in the US instead of switching to a system that is non-market based. It still relies on private hospitals, private drug manufacturers, private physicians, private nursing homes, and private insurers. So you might say, so what? Constitutional principles are bedrock. They're bigger than any single piece of legislation. Right? Why should we care about any of that? The Constitution shouldn't care how important the legislation is. No, I suppose it shouldn't. But the Texas decision, I think, has to be seen in context. And the argument that I'm going to make here is that Congress repeatedly, more than 50 times, voted not to repeal the ACA. Here's one thing that's the same about Congress in 2010 and Congress in 2017. Congress in 2017, famously, with a vote of John McCain, said we are not going to do a skinny repeal. We're not going to repeal the whole thing, and we're not going to repeal just the mandate and just the tax penalty. And quickly, on the heels of that, the Jobs and Tax Cut Act said, let's zero out the tax penalty. That's the only thing that changed about the ACA. 2010, Congress said, let's have the ACA. 2017, Congress said, let's have this ACA. 2017, Congress said, let's have the tax penalty, but let's set it at zero. Let's have an entire system of speed limits on all of our highways, including signs, but let's just paint over the signs with zero. That, the way I'm looking at it, is incredibly unique. You're right. Maybe what should have happened is there should have been a challenge as to whether or not that line in the 2017 Act was itself constitutional to zero out. What?
It has been such a challenge.
I think that's unconstitutional, but even assuming that it's constitutional, what it is it's a deliberate sabotage of another piece of legislation in order to set up something that Congress itself has the power to do, edit or get rid of the ACA, and that it chose specifically not to do many, many times, including months before it zeroed out the tax penalty. This is a sabotage of a piece of legislation in order to set up a constitutional challenge, which has now come. And the constitutional challenge, therefore, I think, should be seen as an effort to undermine the separation of powers. This is where we agree. Your creed says individual freedom, preservation of the separation of powers, right? A couple of things. I want to address the separation of powers in particular. If Congress is going to do the work of editing the ACA, of carving some pieces out of it and leaving other pieces, or of repealing the whole thing and replacing it, or of repealing the whole thing and not replacing it, then Congress needs to do that, because that's the body that legislates, and that's the body that's held accountable for the way they legislate. But this was a great little trick. Let's paint over the $695, let's call it zero, set up a constitutional challenge, and cross our fingers that we get what we want through the judiciary. It's an invitation for the judiciary to reward Congress for sabotaging its own piece of legislation that it had just months before voted to keep intact. I think that's an incredibly important context to recognize before you get into what amounts to being an Alice in Wonderland set of rabbit holes trying to define what counts as standing and injury or not, let alone what constitutes as tax, and trying to figure out how you carve out, whether you can carve out, some provisions from the whole. My feeling is this. It is a risk to our separation of powers to allow such a case to go forward, that any doctrine that's designed to address standing, to address what's the definition of a tax, and to address what constitutes severability, ought to be understood in light of the maneuvers that were taken by the 2017 Congress. And it ought to understand that the right place for this to be is back in Congress. Vote it down, repeal it if you have to, and let the voters decide whether you're going to stay in office. But this is a backdoor. And therefore, the doctrine has to be seen in light of that. So that's my argument so far. So let's consider standing for just a moment. Suffer an injury in fact. The argument is fill out a form or it's a moral wrong. And that's because there is, that somehow it is just an obligation to buy insurance, right? Because that language remains intact. As does the language that there's a tax penalty. It's just that when you calculate it and you work your way down through all the statutory language, you will calculate it to be zero. I think that's reading incorrectly a binding precedent from the Supreme Court about how to understand the choice between paying a penalty and or buying insurance. I'm going to read a section from Justice Roberts' opinion in NFIB that was joined by 4 other justices in Part 3C. In distinguishing penalties from taxes, this court has explained that if the concept of penalty means anything, it means punishment for an unlawful act or omission. While the individual mandate clearly aims to induce the purchase of health insurance, it need not be read to declare that failing to do so is unlawful. Neither the act nor any other law attaches negative legal consequences to not buying health insurance beyond requiring a payment to the IRS. The government agrees with that reading, confirming that if someone chooses to pay rather than obtain health insurance, they have fully complied with the law. Indeed, it is estimated that 4 million people each year will choose to pay the IRS rather than buy insurance. We would expect Congress to be troubled by that prospect if such conduct were unlawful. That Congress apparently rewards such extensive failure to comply with the mandate as tolerable suggests that Congress did not think it was creating 4 million outlaws. It suggests instead that the shared responsibility payment merely imposes a tax citizens may lawfully choose to pay in lieu of buying health insurance. There's still a tax. The tax is zero. If there's a form you have to fill out, then perhaps there will be an invoice, and the invoice will show zero. The way my invoice from Amazon shows shipping, zero. It's an invoice. The tax still exists. The IRS still exists. Its obligation still exists to track who does or doesn't have insurance. The method for calculating still exists. It's still there. These individuals chose to buy insurance instead of paying the tax penalty, which is equivalent of 0. 0 is not an injury, and it was their choice to injure themselves. That does not count as an injury. Filling out a form might be an injury. It's a thin injury, and it's a non-existent form. We don't know yet what the IRS is going to do for 2019. And that's not enough to have standing today. We don't know how the IRS is going to handle that. It's its law to administer. Let me move on to tax. Oh my gosh, this is going to be absurd. It is absurd. There's a structure for taxing, and the tax is 0. Well, if the tax is 0 and it doesn't raise any revenue, is it a tax? Well, if it's not a tax, then what's the IRS doing? Because there's still this system and structure for taxing inside of the IRS, and it still has to be calculated. It's just calculated at 0. Well, let me tell you that this is where context matters. In deciding how to apply doctrine that talks about taxes as raising revenue, I don't know if the federal judiciary has been faced with a problem of what to do when the tax is 0 and it was made 0 on purpose so as to sabotage the tax. Bad facts make bad law. It may be time to rejigger what the factors for what constitutes a tax take account for this kind of backdoor maneuver. And when it gets to severability, I think the argument is you must sever where you can, and the intent of Congress in 2010 and 2017 is no different, and you can tell that from the vote that was taken, and it did not kill the ACA. It preserved the ACA. John McCain voted, other Republicans voted to not eliminate the tax penalty, to not eliminate the individual mandate, and to not eliminate any other part of the ACA. That's its intent, so let's sever. Let's leave the framework in place for another Congress to be able to make some good use of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I have 5 minutes? Okay, that works. Let's start, instead of part 3C of NFIB, let's start in part 3A, right? I know you've all cited this opinion very carefully, but I'll try to give you a brief refresher. In part 3A of NFIB, Chief Justice Roberts finds that the mandate to purchase insurance cannot be supported by the commerce necessary and proper powers. That part only concerned the mandate. He did not mention the penalty at all. Okay. Then in part 3B, he considers the government's alternate argument that the mandate can be supported by the taxing power. He rejects that. He says, I'll read the quote, "The most straightforward reading of the mandate is that it commands individuals to purchase insurance. After all, it states the individual shall. Shall means must, right? Shall maintain insurance." Okay, that was part 3B. But then he says at the end, breaks my heart every time, however, the mandate can be read as imposing a tax for reasons set forth in part 3C, which is the part my friend read from. I'm with him in part 3C. In part 3C, Roberts described this as a choice between going uninsured and paying a penalty. But you only get to 3C with the same because it raises revenue. That's the trigger. If it doesn't raise revenue, you don't get stuck in 3B and the mandate's unconstitutional. If you go through 3A, B, and C of the NFA decision, this follows naturally. I have a piece on this coming out at some point soon, which spells this out in some detail. In terms of the injury, if I anticipate that I'm going to have to file a tax form next year, I have to start preparing and planning for it, that's maybe $1 to pay my accountant. That's enough. It's a thin injury, I agree. It's thin, but it exists. In fact, I've urged Texas to make this argument. They haven't. If they listen to me, I don't know. Judge O'Connor, for what's worth, cited me like 5 times his opinion. I only get cited opinions that are unpopular. They never cite me in good opinions, right? Opinions like. Okay, now let's talk about severability. I don't know how Congress can sabotage the statute, because that presumes that the only way a law can work is based on what they wanted in 2010. The fact that Congress dropped the penalty to 0 reflects the fact that the mandate wasn't working, right? The mandate and penalty were never effective enough to get people to become insured. What keeps the ACA afloat is the subsidies. I think we probably agree with on that point, right? The subsidies that keep the law afloat. The mandate was supposed to be the central, this leg, right? The main leg of the law, and it really proved not to be. As long as you subsidize the hell out of it, the law's surviving. So I don't mean to sabotage the law. I think they reflected the fact that it wasn't that big of a deal. I think even if, it wasn't so politically charged, I think some Democrats probably voted for that law as well. But I want to talk about severability here in a very blunt fashion. We all know what Republicans are trying to do, right? That's real politics, and I think we will agree on that entirely, right? John McCain, thumbs down, skinny repeal. We all saw that video. I was like, whoa, McCain, what are you doing, man? But that's what happened, right? McCain put his thumb down. Bills that are not enacted are not relevant to legislative intent. That's a very basic principle. There are different ways that Congress expresses legislative intent. Not enacting a bill ain't one of them, okay? In 2010, Congress enacted findings in the statute, not in a committee report. And the statute says the mandate is essential to the operation of the law. Congress did not repeal those findings. Those are still in the statute. Go to the U.S. Code, they're still there, right? If a court is faced with some sort of ethereal legislative intent in 2017 or statutory findings in 2010, the statute will control. Now, again, I don't think door number 3 is the correct door. If you had to ask me, the best door is either to kill the tax cut that has raised the penalty up. I think there are problems there. But if that's not the option is door number 2, which is killing GI and CR. Let me explain why that's not the end of the world. Most states, you can give me the numbers, have some form of guaranteed issue on the books, right? States that want it can add it on their own, right? This is not like King v. Burwell, where if the court rules against the government, states lose all this money. I think the GICR in most states would even notice a difference. Texas, you probably would, right? But I think the devastation that would happen is not kids getting kicked off the insurance when they're 26. It'd be a little bit more restrained. But again, this becomes a political issue, right? This decision will be rendered in June of 2020, 4 months before the general election, right? President Trump wants, I guess, the court to kill Obamacare. I think it will be devastating politically for Republicans. But I'm not here as a political pundit. I'm here as a constitutional scholar, and that's where I stand. Thank you all so much. Sorry. Here you go. Thank you.
So I think all of you who are either in legal research and writing too, or those of you who have taken it understand that when you're making your argument before a court, when you're writing your brief, you need a technical argument. It's not enough to argue, here's what I think is the right outcome. I admit the law doesn't support it, but here's what I want as the right outcome. That's not going to work. It also doesn't work to have merely a technical argument, because law is the embodiment of policy, and policy consequences matter. The ripple effects of precedent matter. And what I've been trying to say here is that there are technicalities inside of the Constitution for how to, what the doctrines mean with respect to standing, what the doctrine means with respect to the definition of a tax, and what the doctrine means with respect to severability. But my argument has been to say that needs to be seen in the fullest possible context. And it is meaningful that the legislative branch whose job it is to make legislation, to change legislation, to replace legislation, or to repeal legislation, legislated to zero out a tax penalty that it didn't have the votes to eliminate, so as to set up a constitutional challenge. This feels to me to be a shift of legislative authority to the judiciary. The judiciary is the horrible place to be deciding how much of the ACA exists or doesn't exist. The severability doctrine ought to be seen in that light so as to leave intact as much of the ACA as possible, if for no other reason than to kick it back to the right branch of government to do its work, and to leave intact a framework such that that Congress could do something with it. Otherwise, we have the judiciary striking down legislation that is, by the way, tremendously important and puts us back into a really difficult position. I'm going to tell you something else that's behind door number 3. There have been a tremendous number of consolidations. Hospitals have joined together. They've bought physician practices. They've taken, some of them have started their own insurance programs. They have grown ever, ever larger, and they've done so in order to qualify for the shared savings plan I was telling you about with Medicare. And those things exist in part because of the statutory incentives that are given, the carrot of shared savings. But they're also given in part by a stick that's behind physicians saying, here are some very onerous reporting that you're going to have to do with respect to the quality outcomes of your own work. You're going to have to measure and remeasure, whether you're a doctor's office of 1 or a doctor's office of 25 or a doctor's office of 325. You've got to do this. But one way out of it is to join one of these accountable care organizations, one of these behemoth organizations. So they've been doing it. It starts now. Now's the time when all those reporting requirements are triggered. That's what they want out of. What happens to all that? Well, I'll tell you what happens. Behind door number 3 is a great destabilization of all that's been consolidated since 2010. Some of it will remain, some of it won't. This is not the time to rock the economy in that way. I don't know if there's ever a time to do so. We can't make policy on the basis of that outcome, but we have to consider outcomes when assessing how to apply doctrine, constitutional doctrine. The last thing I'm going to say is this. This is not a case about the difference between the freedom of states and the power of the federal government. This isn't a case that pits freedom of individuals versus the power of government. If you want to think about freedom, you have to think about how do you have freedom? You don't have freedom by the absence of law. You have freedom because you are able to take advantage of opportunity. You have housing, you have shelter, you have an education, and you have decent health. We are costing our economy over and over and over when we don't make sure that people get care when they need it. We're hurting small businesses. We're killing the ideas of people who are would-be entrepreneurs. They might be trying to do something in their garage, but they're too sick to do it, and they might not be able to afford it. You gotta have health to have freedom. I gotta stop. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it. Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So we have a little bit of time, about 10 minutes.
Yeah, so
If you have a question,
Good
raise
night.
your hand. Speak loudly. Andrew, you want to go first?
I have a couple of questions, but specifically it has to do with APMs. You've mentioned APMs a couple of times, and I'm just wondering why the ACA going away would affect APMs in general, considering through contract, and that would mean that a healthcare provider would have to drop that contract altogether. And the growth of APMs by private insurance companies before the ACA was passed, such as the capitation model that was launched in Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont first, and then the continuation well into before the ACA was even conceptualized. It doesn't seem like APMs are going anywhere, and they seem to be a consistent payment model that insurance companies are strong arming healthcare providers, large and small, to continue.
Sure. No, it doesn't mean it has to. It's not as a matter of law saying now we'd love to still stay together, but somehow our contract is unconstitutional. No, it's that the economics incentives created by the statute disappear, and as a result, business decisions have to be reconsidered and remade. Some will stay together, some will break apart, but they'll happen all of a sudden. With respect to alternative payment, APM, alternative payment models, there has, for a long time, we have had something known as prospective payment. And prospective payment means that insurers, both public and private, will pay providers what amounts to being an adjusted average for a particular treatment for a particular diagnosis. And then you make that work within your cost structure. You're either losing money on it, you're breaking even, or you're making money on it. The difference is that, well, capitation largely has failed. Capitation was designed to be used with primary care providers. And when it was rolled out, primary care providers practiced in relatively small groups and they couldn't manage the risk that was associated. Capitation would mean essentially you're taking the financial risk. We'll pay you a certain amount up front each month for all the care that your patients from our insurance company might need. And then you provide all that care. Some months you'll make money, some months you'll lose money. A lot of primary care providers went out of business. Some people see the shared savings plan, the Medicare Shared Savings Program, and accountable care organizations as capitation 2.0, this time with incredibly large organizations that can absorb risk. And that's true. So that's one thing that's very different about it, is it's very large and they can absorb risk. We have yet to see how much that's going to pay off in terms of the Medicare Trust Fund, because the ACA is designed to push more and more doctors into ACOs, and then to push more and more ACOs from the less risky versions of the shared savings program to the more risky. The more risky ones mean this: you can get up to, say, 50, 60%. The ACO can get up to 50 or 60% of what it saves Medicare, but if it costs Medicare more, it has to pay Medicare. There are versions that protect you from paying, but your payoff is lower. So we don't know yet how effective that's going to be, but we certainly do know that the Medicare Trust Fund needs some sort of creative thinking in order to preserve it for as long as we can. So they don't have to fall apart, but they will fall apart. More than half of them would disappear because the financial incentive would disappear as the carrot, and the regulatory incentive would disappear as the stick. Qualifying for the shared savings program. You can't qualify unless you're an ACO, and an ACO has to be a certain size.
I understand that, but I'm saying that in the private insurance market, a lot of these, they don't even have to be ACO, they're just accepting that particular health insurance in general. I know
No.
in some regions, in order to even accept that insurance, you have to abide by what the contract says, and that means whatever model they want.
Yeah, that's right. But physicians generally are free to choose not to participate in that in a way they just aren't free not to participate in Medicare. They may officially, theoretically, choose not to participate in Medicare, but it's really hard.
Maybe another question? Yeah. So the question was about Chief Justice Roberts and whether he's going to write the opinion with my prediction. Let me tell you something. John Roberts breaks my heart every June. Every year a different way, don't know how, and I think he'll break my heart here. He always finds a way to split the difference in a way that makes everyone angry. Maybe that's his unique talent. That's his role in our civil society. So, I like to think that, and I mean this sincerely, when Chief Justice Roberts wrote an FAB that he actually believed that that was a faithful and honest interpretation of the statute as well as a judge. I don't think it was political. I think he actually believed that if there was a way to save the statute, he should. I believe that. I think he was acting in good faith. I truly believe that. And if he believed that, then if the conditions of his opinion no longer control, then he should have a different outcome. Now, he did not weigh in on severability. He didn't have to because he upheld the law. The joint dissenters, the Scalia, Kennedy, Alito block, they did weigh in on severability. So I could see John Roberts saying, okay, you got me. The mandate's unconstitutional, nothing else, go home, right? And I'd actually be happy with that. I agree with my friend. Look, I'm not a healthcare scholar. I don't, he can talk about common law. I can't talk about APOs or everything. So I don't know these things. But I agree with my friend that it would be really bad if the court strikes the entire law, right? There's no replacement in the wings, right? There's nothing lurking that could replace it. It would create a cataclysmic consequence. It's door number 3. I'm with him on that. I agree with that. But that's, again, not my primary concern with this case. Thank you.
We have time for one more.
Another question? If you have questions, please come up after. I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. That was fun. That was very good.
Yeah, so